Welcome to the Resilient Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Kachijian, and today I'm joined by Derek Hansen. Derek is an international sport performance consultant that has been working with athletes of all ages and abilities in speed, strength, and power sports since 1988. His coaching career started in track and field, providing instruction to sprinters of all ages, eventually working with collegiate sprinters, hurdlers, and jumpers. He worked as the head strength and conditioning coach for Simon Fraser University for 14 years, the first non-US member of the NCAA. He also serves as a performance consultant to numerous professional teams in the NFL, NBA, MLS, and NHL, as well as major NCAA Division I programs throughout North America. He specializes in speed development, strategic performance planning, return to competition protocols, and neuromuscular electrical stimulation programming. Medical providers typically dominate the rehabilitation and return to sport conversation, and my conversation with Keba Tolbert on a recent episode made me want to dig deeper into the contribution that technical coaches are and should be making when it comes to injured athlete preparation. Like Keba, Derek comes from a track and field background, where the mindset tends to be more aggressive than that of the medical world. Rehabilitation is about managing, not avoiding risk, as too little risk during the rehab process increases the potential for harm during competitive scenarios. The process of rehabilitation shouldn't be defined by medical providers alone, and Derek's insight is a good reminder that physios don't need to reinvent sport preparation when working with injured athletes. A template already exists, and it just needs to respect pain and injury as a constraint, not as a variable that warrants a complete system overhaul. Derek, thank you so much for coming on. This is the second time you've been on this podcast, and so we're going to talk a little bit more tactical than we did last time. I wanted you to begin by talking about, kind of your role as a consultant and kind of what are the kinds of problems that teams bring you in to solve, and then we can kind of delve a little bit deeper from there.
Yeah, tactical sounds so sexy, so I can't wait.
Yeah, so what are some of the things that like you're brought in as a consultant? I know mainly it's running related stuff, hamstrings. Anything else besides those two areas, or what's kind of your main area of focus with these teams?
Yeah, I would say those are kind of the foot in the door items. So if somebody calls me, it usually is like, hey, we have a problem with a lot of hamstring strains. There's been quite a few of those, I would say. August, September, as sports kind of got back into training camps and all that, whether it was universities or pro sports. And so that's one of the first ones where they're like, yeah, we just having trouble managing this and getting people to stay healthy. And then, as part of that, they're kind of connected in terms of, well, let's look at how they run and let's figure that out. So we do start talking about the biomechanics piece, the loading progression. So I try not to separate those out too much because it's all one and the same. Like if you have somebody who's, as you know, is if you have somebody who's training properly and looks good mechanically and is very efficient, you tend to have less problems. So that's kind of the framework that I operate on as well. What have you guys been doing? What do they look like when they run? What do they look like when they accelerate, decelerate, all those things? And of course, you go through a history, but everything kind of dovetails together when you start getting all this information and data together. You're like, oh yeah, I see the guy run or girl run, and it's clear to me what's going on there. So I would say, if I am brought in to talk about speed or get the team faster or what have you, inevitably we start talking about soft tissue injuries as well, because you can't talk about the success of a team without getting into those areas, because as you know, in this COVID area, if you don't have players on the field or on the court, you're not going to win, right? For whatever reason now. So making sure that durability piece is in there is pretty important with everything I do as well.
Yeah, and developing speed and then the hamstring rehab, I think it's a complementary process, right? Because you can't be fast if you're always getting injured. And I think you would probably attest to some of the mechanical things that need to happen to both run fast and to either prevent or rehab some of these hamstring injuries. And I know this is just, I'm asking, your opinion, your experience. This is not a randomized controlled trial, but in your experience, what are you typically seeing as the main causes of these hamstring injuries in the teams that you work with? And then how does that kind of dovetail into what do you think are some of the issues when it comes to developing and training speed?
Yeah. It's very interesting. I was thinking of you the other day, and I was watching a number of YouTube videos because Chuck Yeager had passed away recently,
Yeah.
and so I'm watching all these things about test pilots, and he was talking about like the risk to reward ratio of like being a test pilot, and obviously there's been casualties, and if you go fast or if you strive to go fast, the risk goes up almost exponentially, and I think that's kind of the same thing that we're talking about here is what's causing a lot of these injuries. Well, in sports where people move slow, you know, and we could probably go through those, but there tends not to be a lot of hamstring injuries, right? Most of the hamstring injuries are not in American football with the O linemen, maybe the D tackles, but it's going to be for the guys who run fast and get up to high speed. So first of all, you're looking at, okay, which people are hitting high speed, and they're going to be in the higher risk group, irrespective of mechanics and all that. Just by running fast, you're putting yourself at risk. And then you start looking at things like, okay, well, how prepared are you to run fast? So there's a physiological component, and there's a biomechanics component to that as well. So if you are running fast a lot and you're not in shape, or you're required to run fast, whether it's chasing somebody or trying to catch a pass, a deep pass, um, and you're not prepared for that. And this happens a lot in training camp scenarios when people come to say an NFL training camp, and they're used to doing their workouts with whoever, maybe a private sector person, or they've taken some time off, and then they go back and it's like, well, we need this many reps to evaluate you, or this many reps to get up to speed, in terms of the plays we're running and the scenarios that we're running. So right away, the load goes up. Everybody's running a lot more at a relatively high speed, which could be higher than, maybe 15 to 25 miles per hour, anywhere in that range there, which is fast enough to get hurt. And so you put all those things together, um, you know, out of shape, a lot of demand, and even the stress of competition, the stress of like, I have to make this team. And you've kind of set yourself up for a lot of the problems associated with hamstring strain, right? And the most common one is, when people are running upright, and the natural stride cycle is, lift the knee, and then, the lower leg and foot kind of reach out a bit and pull back through. And when you hit the ground, that's usually when the problem occurs, because the hamstring stretches, it's trying to prevent the knee from kind of hyperextending up, and then it's under the greatest length and tension, and then you hit the ground. That's usually when you pull. So either you have good biomechanics and you're not excessively overstriding and creating that problem, and or you're strong enough to handle that, because you could argue that there's a lot of people out there that don't have great mechanics but are powerful, and maybe they've endured, the stresses of that action, because they're just strong. And I think something like you know I was going to say Scandinavian, but the what's the name of that thing? Oh, it's not Scandinavian,
The
but the
Nordic?
Nordic. There
Yeah.
you go.
Yeah.
Anyways, the Nordic hamstring eccentric exercise. See, I've just blanked it because I don't even use that. But people use that, and they're trying to like strengthen, like, let's strengthen, right? And okay, there's obviously an application for that, and it's sort of a catch-all in terms of like, okay, let's get everybody strong so that they don't get into that late swing phase and strain the hamstring, right? Now, I have some reasons why I don't use that, but we can get into that. But certainly, maybe strength is a possibility of resolving it, but also the specific preparedness of being able to run fast and get into those positions with the right technique, under the volumes that you will encounter in training camp and games and all that. So I'm kind of looking at everything and going, first of all, let's make sure that mechanically you are sound. And then on top of that, can you maintain that mechanical efficiency over, you know, a variety of speed changes, but also a given volume that we need you to be at. And with all of that, I'm trying to create a level of proficiency so that they have a reserve over different speeds over different durations, and maybe they get into like a slight biomechanical anomaly where they can still handle it because they're strong enough, right? So those are all the things I'm looking at in terms of like causes and trying to kind of fix the process or fix the problem with the hamstring strains.
Yeah, and in terms of mechanics, like what are the red flags for you? Because I think in physio now there's a trend where the pendulum is swinging way towards like there's no good or bad mechanics. It's all about kind of like load management, and as long as you systematically prepare for a particular activity, like running, for example, so that the prevailing thought now is, well, your body can adapt to running as long as you build up your mileage if you're a distance runner, or you have the right programming if you're a sprinter. That the mechanical phenomenon itself isn't as important. And I think that's probably a reaction to where like physio used to be very, very biomechanically oriented, and now there's kind of a maybe an overreaction, pendulum swing too far the other way. Um, my personal belief is that, especially at high speeds, that mechanics do matter. And I think a lot of times people will say, well, even the best sprinters in the world with the quote unquote best mechanics will strain their hamstrings. Therefore, a team sport athlete shouldn't worry about it too much, which again, I don't know if that's the best logic, but in your opinion, what are the mechanical things that you immediately, you highlight as, okay, this is something that I want to address because, they're at risk for injury?
Yeah, there's some good points there. And I again, when we talk about high speeds and high performance, you look at something like, say, the um, automobile racing, and I can drive. You'll I remember, you'll be in New York and you're driving on the freeway and you see some guy driving a Honda Civic with his wheel like wobbling. You're like, oh, I wonder how long that'll last, right? And then you keep seeing him every morning, right? And he's doing okay. But if you see a Formula One car with the wheel wobbling, like, that's going to be bad very soon. And I think it's the same thing with athletics and high performance. Like you said, if you're approaching 26, 27 miles per hour and something is just off by a little bit, and it could be one stride, right? You're running and everything looks really good, and for whatever reason somebody's beside you or trying to catch you, and you push that little extra bit on that one stride and it just throws everything, the equilibrium off of that stride cycle. A lot of the time that's enough to create a problem. So I don't necessarily buy the idea that, well, these elite sprinters still pull their hamstrings. Like, obviously Usain Bolt did towards the end of his career, but he was relatively healthy throughout. So, and if you add up all of those steps at high speed, like if you said, how many
Yeah.
steps did Usain Bolt take over 25 miles per hour? Well, I don't know. We're talking like 10,000, 100,000, whatever, right? That's way more than almost anybody else has done, and he's been relatively healthy aside from maybe one competition or two competitions. So I think you're trying to work on that basis and go, like you said, let's make sure technically everything's in place, and then technique does change with velocity, right? So if you're jogging, that's going to be a different technique than if you're running. If you're jogging at 10 miles per hour or 8 miles per hour, if you're going 20 plus miles per hour, things change. And a lot of that is going to be how much force you put into the ground, and then how much you kind of vertically, bounce up from that. So when you see somebody jogging, their hip height is very low and they can land a little more out in front of their center of mass. Whereas if when you're running fast, it's more of this sort of pogoing effect and you're landing a little more underneath, to create that vertical, um, positive displacement up. And if you're doing that, that's good. But as soon as you start to overstride under that condition, then you're putting yourself at risk. The leverage is off and all that. But at slow speeds, you can be less efficient. And they've kind of proven this, that, in terms of efficiency, in terms of like speed, you have to have a high hip position. You have to land underneath. But if we're walking or jogging and the forces are way less, you can land out in front and you can brake and you can kind of vault over that. And that's more economical in terms of like going a long distance. And you'll see that just by watching long distance runners versus
Yeah.
sprinters. You'll see that the knee height and the heel recovery is way different because it's just designed differently in terms of what your intent is. So I think you're always looking at all of these things together and going, okay, well, okay, jogging is a lot different. And I have in my courses, I have some, EMG readings of what jogging looks like and when the muscles fire, or walking versus sprinting. And it's way different. So you have to recognize that and understand, okay, when they're sprinting, we have to make sure we emphasize vertical action. When you're jogging, you can emphasize it as well, but there's a little more horizontal jogging forward and back, and that's okay because you're not going to get injured at a slower speed. But as soon as we start going faster and faster and faster, we have to make sure there's that vertical action, and also utilizing like elastic responses more. And as soon as you start taking advantage, like as if you take a ball and you just let it bounce, it doesn't bounce as high. If you put energy into it and then you pummel it into the ground, it'll come up a lot higher. And you do take advantage of that elasticity of that basketball or whatever ball. So the same thing happens with the human body, where if you put more force in the ground, it forces the lower limbs, and you're doing this progressively, to be more elastic. And that becomes part of your propulsion system. So you don't have to hit the ground and then pull on the ground to go faster. You just hit the ground and your body responds and goes up. So understanding all these different mechanisms, I think, is important as well, because if somebody is not elastic, they're going to have to use more muscular energy to create propulsion. And I want people to be that very taut basketball where you just throw it down the court and it just keeps bouncing and not plopping on the ground.
Yeah, and I would imagine there's not a disparity between how you would teach someone to run to be faster and how you would teach someone to run maybe to prevent or rehabilitate a hamstring injury. They're kind of like, learning how to run faster with good technique is presumably going to put your hamstring at less risk. Because I think a lot of times, like some of the physios who are a little bit more of the on the anti-mechanical side will say, well, we can't prove that changing your sprinting to having a more vertical foot strike is going to prevent injury. Therefore, it's not worth the investment. But if you want to run faster, it probably is worth the investment. So it's almost like the performance and the medical side of things are really just two sides of the same coin. They're not. There's not really a disparity between the two objectives, right?
Yeah, and I'm as big a proponent of research and studies as you are, and it's sometimes it's just really difficult to study these things in isolation. So I don't even know how you would really properly study that in terms of, like, cueing people and coaching them, because everybody responds to a different cue differently. So where some people, I have to, like, an example being, some people I say, I want you to consciously put more force into the ground downwards, right? And then some people I have to say, I want you to lift the opposite leg up faster, because if I say put force into the ground, they tend to just put force in the ground and then keep pushing on the ground, which negates the elastic response. Where if I say just think lift off the ground, they get off the ground quicker and their timing is better. So it's very hard to study that. I don't know. I mean, you could say, okay, these are the down people and these are the up people, and then you do a study, but it really depends on how they interpret that cue as well. So, some people, like they say, some people have to have the receptor sites for that cue. And if you don't, then you got to give them another cue. So I think, you know, I'm really always, if I'm working with somebody on hamstring rehab, I'm trying to figure out what will push their buttons in the right way. And that's no different than if I'm working with somebody on a speed project and, like, we're trying to get faster. I'm trying to connect with them and figure out what is the best way to get the desired outcome. So if it's that vertical force production, it could be up, it could be down. Sometimes it does, like, I don't like using the word push, because it kind of, intuitively, a lot of people think it means like really a long time, push a long time on the ground. But sometimes with some athletes, I say push and they do better. So, I think I'm always aware of, what everybody's particular cue could be to solve the problem. I know what I want. I know what I want it to look like, but I may have to use different language around eliciting that response from somebody. And I think that's kind of the interesting part is, you have to really work at it. Like, you can't just go, okay, here's your workout, go do it. Go on the corner. Let's go do the physio thing in the corner over there. Go do your exercises and then report back to me. You actually have to walk them through it. You have to watch a rep, give them different cues. Okay, how does that feel? Okay, that feels really easy. It feels really bouncy. Oh, okay, that's what I want. Um, Or that feels like, I feel a lot of pain when I really push. Okay, well, let's get away from pushing. So I think that coaching piece may be what's missing for a lot of people when, they have a template of how it should work, but then you got to get in there and you got to be a human being.
Okay. And so, in terms of, you mentioned earlier when we were offline about diagnosing these injuries and how, the MRIs are kind of a blessing and a curse, because in some cases the MRIs are almost overly sensitive, and they give people, medical providers, reasons to fixate on things and hold people back, and that it probably creates a bias towards maybe being overly conservative. So, you know, what do you think that physios, medical staffs can do better in terms of, like, from a functional standpoint? It's easy to diagnose somebody has a strained hamstring, but what, in the people that you've worked with, even people with, like, say, like a grade 2, like, what does your progression look like from the day you get the MRI result to the timeline in terms of when you can get people back to high velocity running? Because I mean, I've had experiences with some physicians where I've gotten a referral, strained hamstring, grade 2, and this is maybe like 6 weeks after the original injury. The athlete's done zero running. In one case, I had an athlete who was going to a Division 1 program for track for the 100 and the 200, and he was told to take his entire winter season off actually a spring season. So he injured the hamstring during indoor and, like, the state meet. So this is maybe in, like, whatever it is, like February or something like that. And then he was told you should take the entire spring off to rest for college. And so, like, he hadn't run in 6 weeks. Of course, the first session, I had him doing tempos on the curve or doing different, mock drills and some easy accelerations, and just to prove to him that, like, you actually can do things. But it seems like there's like, do hamstring exercises, maybe work up to Nordics, but people are still very afraid to run, and they just see it as all or nothing. You're either injured or you have to run at 25 miles an hour, and there's no in between. So how do you go from that, like, that MRI stage to really diagnosing the problem from a functional standpoint, not just a pure pathology in the MRI, and then building that person up until they actually are running at a higher velocity?
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, I'm a big proponent of getting as much information as possible. So if somebody does have an image, ultrasound or MRI, it does inform you about what you can do. And if obviously you see the hamstring like on just one final strand there, like you're going to treat it differently than if it's just a smaller tear. Um, but most of the time, it is going to be, I would say, function based in terms of, okay, like you said, can you march on the spot? Can you lift your knee without pain? Yes, I can do that, right? Okay. Now, can you do it at this rate? A little faster. Yeah, still feels good. Okay, how about if we skip and you put a little more force in the ground? I feel it a little bit there, but it's not getting worse. And so it's this iterative approach of like talking to somebody, seeing, are they guarding? Um, what kind of response are they giving you? What is showing on their face, like if they're like as they're doing it, or it's like, no, that's fine. And this working back and forth from rep to rep, and obviously I have some guidelines around, if it's a grade 2, I'm probably going to do this many reps, this many sets, and then I'll cut it off. Like I don't need them to keep going. I don't, and I'm very careful about that. Like, let's keep going until they do wince or they feel so pain. No, I'll usually cut it off and live to fight another day. And we'll do this on consecutive days, right? And I had this theory that if I had somebody for five visits in 5 days, I could probably do better as a physical therapist, which I'm not, but I could probably do better because I'm getting data day after day after day after day, and we can build up this momentum and get them to a certain place rather than seeing them once or twice a week. So I do it on consecutive days, and the first day, you do whatever, marching, skipping, high knees, maybe some running high knees at low amplitude. Then they come back the next day. How do you feel? It feels a little stiff, which is to be expected, right? They did some movement. And again, this might be 2 or 3 days following the initial injury. And then come in again. Okay, let's do exactly what we did last time. And then we'll add a bit. So you have a choice of whether or not you want to add volume, so you can add more sets or reps. You can add intensity, and intensity is going to be dictated by amplitude. So if I lift my knee up higher, I put more force into the ground. If I lift it low, so I'll have, I call them gears. Gear one is ankle height, gear two is mid shin, gear three is opposite knee height. So that's how high you step, and that'll determine how much force you can put in the ground. So I'll have these sort of checkpoints where I'm like, oh, let's do everything in gear one. No problem. Okay, we go to gear two, still no problem. And maybe the transition from gear two to gear three is a more careful, measured progression. But when I get them to those heights and they're putting force into the ground vertically, which doesn't have that sort of late swing stretch, right? Then I'm like, okay, they can handle the stance phase, they can handle this, the swinging motion of the leg to some degree, and then I can start thinking about adding horizontal components to it. So it is really, despite what may be showing up on the imaging, it is competency based, and obviously how they feel, right? And so I've had people who've been diagnosed with like a grade 2 who've come back in 7 to 8 days. And I don't know if that's a diagnosis problem or they're just very fast at healing or whatever it is. But, I don't necessarily constrain myself based on what an image or, some other practitioner has necessarily deemed the classification of the injury, because I've seen things move very quickly, and I've seen grade ones take a little longer for whatever reason. So I think, um, I think you just have to assess what's in front of you, and then with that information, you move forward, and you're just trying to notch things up very gradually. And most of the time, it works really well. And I rarely have setbacks because I'm very careful about that sort of iterative approach and moving things up. Now, have people improved quicker? Yes, but a lot of time that's out of necessity. Like, we have a playoff game in 7 days, he has to be ready, and if they don't win that game, then they're out. So, okay, we'll put him in. Oh, look, he played a full game, no problems, right? I'm not necessarily taking credit for that. I'm just sort of like, all right, okay. So let's kind of continue some of that progression for the next round of the playoffs or whatever. So that's happened a lot, but I think if you're just using a measured, common sense approach around a lot of this, you can advance people pretty quickly. And and I'm going to say this, but in Canada, you don't have the luxury a lot of the time, unless you want to pay for it up front, to get an MRI right away, right? So sometimes it'll be after the fact to prove that, yes, what I did, healed the hamstring properly. But I think I've worked better under those circumstances because I don't have all this fancy technology to tell me, yes, you can train them or you can't. It's kind of like it's like, hey, you talk to them, kind of like, I guess if you were training a horse, you can't really talk to them. So maybe the imaging is more useful, but it's kind of the same thing. You're working off of what has worked in the past and applying it to your population. So
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're trying to get people doing things that resemble running as soon as they can. It could be the same day or the next day, whether that's a step over, even like a resisted acceleration, something where you're training with intent, but at a lower velocity where there's less stress on the hamstring. What do you, I mean, it might seem like an obvious question, but can you speak to the downside of waiting too long to do those activities? Because when you have someone who's kind of in purgatory where it's like, well, you've got a grade 2, we don't know what to do, let's not run, let's rest. Like, what's the downside to telling somebody, okay, like, we're not going to run for 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks? Because in my experience, the longer you wait to do that, even from like a psychological standpoint, that's more difficult it is for the athlete to ever want to run fast again. And so it seems like there's a critical window of opportunity earlier on to kind of overcome some of that inhibition. And there's also, I think it speaks to the way that we diagnose these injuries where it's very tissue centric. You have a grade 1, a grade 2, or a grade 3, and it's based on the amount of muscle damage, but there's also redundancy built into the body. And I mean, if you or I or anybody else is rehabilitating an athlete to run at close to max velocity a week after a grade 2, that hamstring hasn't healed. It's just that you can work around that pathology. So there's obviously like a neurological component to it too. But what's again that downside to not being aggressive enough?
yeah, very good points again. Like I think a lot of people in physio talk a lot about like, oh well, we don't want them to compensate with other muscles, right? But we're doing it all the time. Um, so I factor that in a lot. But at the same time, whenever you don't do something, there's going to be a detraining effect, and that's going to be physiological, but it's also, there's a skill component to that as well, as you know. And there's, like you said, the psychological component is huge. So there's one team I was helping out, and their typical approach was like an 8 to 10 week return to play process for hamstrings, right?
Even in
um,
season, 8 to 10 weeks.
yeah.
Wow.
So right then and there, as soon as somebody pulls a hamstring under that regime, they know that they're going to be out for 2 months. Like, that's just the way it goes, right? Because of, they have a very conservative approach. So when we started doing my approach and got them back in 2 to 3 weeks at minimum, um, even just the attitude of the players changed in terms of being engaged in the process, because they're like, oh, I know I'm going to get back faster. And so there wasn't that same anxiety around being injured because of whatever. I don't know if it obviously it affected them in terms of being around the team, but maybe there's like financial incentives around it as well, like, games missed is tied to your contract, who knows. But I think that psychological component is huge. If you come, like, if I do a walk and jog program to get you back for a hamstring injury, I know that's less effective. But also, I know that when a player does a walk and jog program, and they're doing it on the sidelines and they see everybody else running, if I'm doing a sprint based process where I'm running progressively, longer sprints from a short distance, and they're like, wow, this is a lot closer to what's happening on the field beside me. So I think you can't discount that psychological component. On top of that, there's all the detraining effects and atrophy and shortening and, of muscles and all that, that I think is huge. I think also the skill component is lost. So if you if you don't sprint for, let's say, that 8 to 10 week period, or at least 6 of those weeks, it's a skill that you've lost. Like, I know with myself, and I'm no spring chicken, but if I don't sprint and I take some time off, when I get back to it, I have to be pretty careful about, how fast I go and how hard I push, because I've lost a bit of that skill, like neurological, in terms of timing and coordination, intramuscular coordination. So I know that I have to come back carefully and I have to have a progression. So I think that's the other portion of it. And I don't even know how you classify it. So there's the tissue strength and the physiology component, there's the psychological component, and then there's the skill component, and I think they're tightly interwoven. And if you get away from any of those, or if you have a deficiency in any of those, it's going to hamper you on your return. And then doubly, you're going to question your ability and to stay healthy again. So if you're out for 8 to 10 weeks and you've lost some of that skill and that physiological ability, when they put you back on the field, you're thinking, I don't want to hurt myself again. I haven't really tested it. All of those things come back, and it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, which I see a lot. You'll see that, oh, he's hurt his hamstring again. He's hurt it. Okay. Well, if you resolve the technical component, if you resolve the loading component, and they're psychologically feeling good about themselves, they're probably not going to pull again. But you've seen it more often than I have, that we have these chronically injured hamstring individuals, and then they're labeled, and that's going to affect their career in terms of their, longevity. Not necessarily longevity like physically, but just the perception of their longevity and their effectiveness. So I think all of those things factor in. And I think that's why my approach works really well. It doesn't give people time to create a deficiency or, um, a
Yeah,
detraining effect.
you don't have too long to feel sorry for yourself.
No,
Yeah.
no, and it's not like it's a careless approach. It's
Sure.
not like
Yeah, of
this
course.
over aggressive, careless approach. It's very measured, but um, I think there's an understanding, like with any injury, right? Like, there's a window of opportunity that you have to hit in terms of to get people back and in a timely manner. And if you miss that window, whether it's in range of motion in a knee or something like that, it's very hard to get back to. So I'm always thinking about that. Like, the clock is ticking, and it's not ticking because we have to get them back on the field because they have to score goals or whatever. It's ticking because I know there's physiological realities around that window of opportunity.
Yeah, and so if I'm oversimplifying your philosophy, it's be as aggressive as possible without doing any harm. Early on, it's not careless because it's very athlete driven. You're going off, how it looks to you, but more importantly, how it feels to the athlete. So the athlete is the ultimate driver of what he or she does or or doesn't do. And so early on, because it's very subjective, it's based on symptoms and what things look like to you in terms of technique, motor patterns, compensation. Like I said, it might be doing some step overs, it might be doing some, acceleration work that's either at a short distance or loaded to reduce the velocity, reduce, upright running and the potential for a hamstring injury. And then ultimately you're going, because the gold standard is max velocity running upright. Early on, it's very subjective between your eyes and that athlete's perception of pain and fear. What's your kind of, before you say, okay, you're good to go play in a game, what is your kind of objective criteria where you're not leaving it to chance? Because even if you tell an athlete, like, okay, do you feel like you're ready to play in a game? They might say yes, but that's depending on the athlete's, own kind of recklessness. That may or may not be a good way to do it. It should certainly play a role, but what makes you satisfied besides your eyes that, okay, this athlete is safe to play in a game?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it's going to be, it's going to be volume related. So, have they accumulated enough volume at a given speed?
Mhm.
And because I do a distance based approach, so it's like short sprints that start with maybe 10 yards, 10 meters, and then they start inching out from there. And, they may go as far as 30, 40, 50 meters. So, by virtue of the fact that we start them short, they can only hit a certain velocity. So, they might only hit maybe 65 to 70% of their max velocity running 10 yards. So right then, if I keep them at 10, they're not going to go over 65, 70%. There's no way. It's just not physically possible, right? Unless they're going downhill. And then if you take them out to 12 and a half meters, 15, and 17 and a half, 20. And that the reason I do that is that usually is about a step, right? Every time I take them out. And people are like, well, a step, that's not much. But if you look at the velocity data that you see from sprinters, a step can be a lot of, can be a lot of velocity gain. One step can, pop you up that velocity chart pretty quickly. So you got to be very careful with the number of steps or the distance. But if I go 10 yards, 10 meters for a certain number of sessions, and then we go up to 12 and a half, 15, I know that every time we run, we're going to hit at least 65, 70% of max velocity, which doesn't happen a lot in sports. Let's be honest.
Mhm.
Um, so, because they're shorter acceleration distances, but I know that even if I get them to run 20, they still run that 10. If I get them to run 30, they've run 10. So even the volume of 10-meter accelerations has grown over, let's say, 2 weeks. So I know just by the fact that I might be doing 300 yards of total distance, and then the next day I do 350, and then I do 400, 500, 550, whatever. Over that 2 weeks on consecutive days, that's more high quality running than they've done practicing or playing a
Right.
game. So we're kind of creating a reserve effect by just doing this repetitively every day. And we may give them a day off here and there, but you can see like one of the teams that I work with, they just compile everything based on GPS. And GPS isn't the most precise way of doing it, but you still get a measure of distance, number of accelerations over a certain velocity or rate, and a velocity. So you can go, okay, 80% of our runs have been at least 15 miles per hour or greater, have hit, you know. And then if you measured that on consecutive days, if you measured that compared to when they practice or when they play, it's way and above what they're going to do in a game. So you're kind of overcompensating to some degree and creating a reserve so that when they go back to the game, I don't know, they could play the whole bloody game and still not come close to what we did in practice. Right. So I just know based on the time we spend and the distances we cover that if they have to play, and this is what's happened with this one team in Europe, because they had an important game in like a Champions League game. Um, the coach said, "We really need that guy. We're going to put him in for at least, usually it would be 20 minutes, 40 minutes, 60 minutes. Like we need him in there. He's got to play 60 plus minutes this game. Otherwise, we're out of the tournament." He played a little stiff afterwards, and then he played the next game, and he's fine. So you're really by doing this approach, you're really filling all these gaps and then some so that they're ready to perform at or beyond what you need them to be. And I think that's the key, is that it's a, like you said, it's a measured intelligent approach that doesn't put them at risk, but it's still filling all these areas that they'll need in the game anyways. Like if you look at the average football player, like they might accelerate 5 or 10 yards, right? And that's not even at full speed because somebody's in their way, or they don't want to, get out of position in the game, or overrun the quarterback when they're trying to pursue them. So if you look at sports that way and you go, okay, I just have to do more than that in my training and my preparation, then I know they'll be ready. I think that works really well. Whereas if you do say you do like a Nordic based program, or you did a walk jog program, which has no relation to anything that's happening on the field. You could argue that, well, we're working on work capacity, we're working on strength. Yeah, but that again, that's not as specific as what's happening on the field with short acceleration, and the velocity at which that hamstring is lengthening and shortening. And so now you're missing that. And then if you decide, well, after 2 weeks of doing Nordics and jogging, we're going to start sprinting, well, you've just lost 2 weeks of training. And now you're behind the eight ball, because if they want you back and you do have to hit 20 miles per hour, well, you're nowhere near that. Good luck, right? Or we've just done it one workout. So I think that's what I kind of hang my hat on, is we've done the work, right? And if they have to go above and beyond what normally happens in a game, well, that box is checked off.
So, in, across different sports, like what are maybe some target volumes you're looking for before you say somebody's ready? Like examples might be skill position player in American football to a soccer player, more of a field sport athlete. I would imagine that the football player is going to have less of a volume than the soccer player. But what are you looking to kind of ramp people up to before you sort of discharge them in terms of their volumes? And then is that at like maximum intent? Are you giving them kind of like an RPE in terms of like what's the intensity at that given volume?
Yeah, it's I would say the curve of that progression is relatively parabolic, in terms of, like, you're going to increase volume like this, and then it'll start to drop off as you get closer to playing a game.
Yeah.
But the velocity will, go up like this, right? So as that volume drops off, the velocity goes higher, right? So you're trying to find a critical volume, which could be, like I said, our first session might be 200 to 300 yards of, 20 to 30 reps of 10-yard sprints. And then it may go as high as anywhere from 600 to 1,000. So it could be 60 to 100 reps of tens. And then as the velocity starts going up, we start dropping that off, and we may get down to around 300 to 500 yards of total reps. And that could be tens, or that could be 15s or 20s. So it might be, again, 20 to 30 reps of sprints. um, would they be max velocity? Well, no. If it starts getting to max velocity, then the volume has to come down and the recovery has to open up. So those initial sessions, it would be like run there, run back, run there, run back. And that kind of dampens the velocity and the intensity by just adding more volume. So when the volume peaks at 1,000, the velocity is not that high, but we're kind of strengthening them with the volume. And then we drop off the volume, and then we get a little more precise with the velocities that they have to hit. And so it's kind of like just a training program, right? I mean, that's all it is. Which is why a lot of rehab professionals might not really understand it. Like, you have to have a really, like yourself, you have to have a solid basis of training athletes, and then you're like, oh, okay, I can manipulate volume intensity in this way, and I can expand recovery so that the velocity goes up, or I can contract the recovery so that I keep the volume in a safe, or the velocity at a safe place. And I can also restrict how far they go. And if you don't understand all of this stuff, my approach seems like it's really crazy. But if you do understand how all this stuff interacts with each other, you're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Yeah. Short distances, they won't get to upright position, and they'll have more knee flexion on ground contact, so that means less stress on the hamstring. Oh, okay, yeah.
Right.
So, right, but you have to have that, you know pedigree, or that background, and understanding how these different things interact together, and then it makes perfect sense. So once I have somebody to that, like, I've been doing a lot of virtual stuff where I just walk people through it, and I've had a lot of success, through surrogates or whatever. I haven't been there to teach them, but I've walked them through it, and I said, this is how you do it. And then we check in every week. How's it going? Good. They may have a little technical question, but it's very easy to implement, if you understand all the things to look at. from a distance. You don't have to. I don't have to be there, which is great.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's probably the scariest for coaches and physios to implement an approach like yours, especially with an injured athlete, because I find that a lot of times people don't even want to approach or touch things like mechanics until somebody is injured. It's assumed that if someone is quote unquote healthy, that they don't need to work on anything. And then all of a sudden, when an athlete is injured, they're under the microscope and there's a lot more scrutiny. But it's one thing manipulating volume and intensity in a rehab protocol. But now I would imagine you work with a lot of athletes where if the first time you meet them is when they're injured, granted, you might not be getting a total 100% accurate snapshot of how they run because their pain could be influencing how they run. But if they're probably a massive overstrider with, an injured hamstring, it's presumably they were also a massive overstrider prior to the injury. I think a lot of coaches and physios are scared. Like, I don't want to try to tweak how an athlete runs because they've been doing it their whole life. And am I going to screw them up? So I think a lot of times rehab does provide a nice opportunity to work on mechanics because your output
Oh,
is necessarily lower. But if you kind of know what you're doing and you understand what good technique looks like and how to coach it, like what's possible and how quickly are you able to see athletes internalize some of these mechanical changes where they can go on the field and not have to think about it, and you're not worried about did I get in their head and make them think about running in an overly technical way, whereas prior to the injury, that's all they did was they just ran, didn't think about it.
yeah. I mean the this process is a wonderful opportunity for you to fix their running, right? Um, and you've probably seen that yourself, where somebody comes to you and um, doesn't matter what kind of injury it is. If they're a running athlete, your first priority is to look at their running, and maybe that was the cause, and maybe that's part of the solution, right? So I think for me, when I work with an athlete, it's my opportunity to, one, fix their running, but the other one is to get buy-in around my approach. So if we do get them back to health, now they will adopt my approach to training, which resolves all of these things as well, right? And whether it's technical, whether it's finding the right volumes and loads and all that. But I think if there was a case in the NFL where we're looking at somebody who had chronic hamstring pulls, and it was purely mechanical. Like this was a fast twitch individual who had great performance on the field, but the problem was chronic injuries, a lot of soft tissue injuries. And a lot of the time, I find that if somebody has a lot of hamstring issues, it can manifest itself into other injuries, as you probably have seen as well. So even ACL injuries.
Mhm.
So right off the bat, they send me video. I'm like, yep, this is a classic case of somebody with their hips sitting too low, overstriding, pelvis is anteriorly rotated. As part of that, right? They're kind of their posture's off. And so as soon as you see that, you're like, yep, we need to fix that. We need to start from maybe some drill based work and then progress from there. Um, and I'd say 9 times out of 10, it does work. It does help the situation, but like you said, you need somebody on the ground that feels confident with identifying those technical issues, and then feels confident with prescribing work and giving cues to help fix it as well. And it doesn't take much. Like I said, I can do this by distance with a lot of practitioners. Um, and once they get some momentum around it, they're like, oh, okay, now I know, I can see what you're saying. Yep, we got it, and they cue them properly. And the one thing I did notice, and this is not again, this is not a slight on PTs or ATCs or anything like that, but I think a lot of them were shocked at how much work it was to actually watch every rep, keep an eye on every step, maybe video record, review it. And they're like, this is a lot of work. I got to spend a lot of time with them. I'm like, yes, yes, it is. But if you do this, this won't be a problem anymore. If you fix this now, obviously there's going to be some maintenance that they have to do. But if you fix this now mechanically, this athlete is now off your plate, and you can work with other, rehab cases that demand more attention. But you do have to put in that initial work. um, and maybe it's just a different way of doing things that you're used to. But being on the field with them and working with them, you're going to learn a lot about them. You're going to learn a lot about the process, and it's going to pay off. and you will have a much better idea of how to communicate with the performance staff and the strength staff and saying like, this is what I see, what do you see? And maybe they can help fix it so that it doesn't become a problem. Because usually what happens when I finish an RTP process is, okay, they need a minimum amount of volume to address this so that they don't have a problem moving forward. um, and it may not be a lot. It might be like a micro dosing approach of like getting them to do a certain number of sprints of a certain distance as part of their warm up so that they check that box off. Because once they start playing, like a perfect example is a defensive back in football, where a lot of their work is, backpedaling and multi-directional, and they don't get into a lot of full out sprints. And when they do, their hips seem to be a little lower because that's how they're taught just in their movement. So you have to kind of teach them, okay, when we sprint, we get up higher, we can hit higher velocity, safer, blah, blah, blah. And then when you lower down, you can change direction. But a lot of the time, somebody hasn't pointed that out to them. Like a football coach rarely would.
Mhm.
They would look at very specific stuff. And so you have to point that out to them, and then usually it resolves itself. They don't have so many problems.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times it's easy to justify that something doesn't matter if you don't understand it. And I know because at one point that was sort of me where I wasn't as comfortable analyzing running. So you can just rationalize, well, like because I can't do it, it must not matter. But I think if you have it in your toolbox to be able to analyze it and have the ability to change it if warranted, you can always choose to not do it. But then now you're making a decision based on what's kind of best for the athlete and the circumstances, not because you have a knowledge gap. And that's where I think sometimes, there's always a judgment call with this stuff. Because I think that for like somebody who's coming off an ACL surgery where they have like 8 to 12 months to rehab, then it's very easy to make mechanical changes along the way because there isn't that time pressure. And because you're doing gait retraining as part of that athlete's initial acute rehab, you can kind of sprinkle in things that look like running progressions into that gait retraining. It becomes a little bit trickier when you're like maybe the pressure you've been under where it's like, okay, you've got, a week to get this athlete ready for a playoff game in the Premier League and you've never worked with that athlete before. Based on certain time constraints, would you ever adapt purely like a load management, just volume and intensity based approach and kind of abandon the mechanics? Or do you always try to address that mechanical piece? Like if you've got a week, for example, do you say, well, I don't think I have enough time to mess with mechanics. I'm just going to try to get this person to run the way they would normally run, do a couple of tens, build up the distance, or and I know it's hard to speak in absolutes, but are there ever situations where you feel like you don't have the time or it doesn't make sense to address the mechanical piece, or is that always kind of a big part of what you're doing?
I mean, I think I bring it up with the staff and I say like this is part of the problem. But like you said, reestablishing load and building resiliency around that load is probably more important. Like
Yeah.
um because you could fix the mechanics, and if you haven't done the load piece, they're still going to be vulnerable. They're going to
Right.
misstep and then it's going to fall apart. So I would say yes, if they run with like running backs are a perfect example. Like they have to run with their hips low with more knee flexion on ground contact because of contact and direction change. So if you're working with Barry Sanders, do you want to change that a lot? Do you want to say, "No, we got to be up higher," right? Because if somebody hits him, he'll go flying.
Yeah.
So I think in that case, you're going to go, okay, we need you to do this prescribed load, this many reps, and keep doing that. Just stay relaxed. Try not to be too tight when you do it, and that may be all. And there's been a lot of cases where we've done like a 3 week RTP, and then I never see that athlete again or ever talk to them again. And I honestly feel very I feel some anxiety around that because I know, okay, we only did a 3 week fix, we have to integrate this into the program, and for whatever reason people just don't care, or they're just like, okay, we're going to move on to the next, that guy's solved, we're going to move on to the next project. And sometimes they don't have a problem ever again, and sometimes there's a recurring problem. So it's yeah, you know how it is, you can't save everybody.
Yeah.
um so it's always in the back of my mind that yes, there is a sort of long term plan that should be in place for all of these athletes so that it doesn't become a problem. It doesn't rear its ugly head again. But that's very tough. Like, and that's why like I've gone back with a lot of my courses and I've said, okay, let's try to get the younger. PTs and the younger strength coaches trying to follow this philosophy. Um, and to some degree, I've kind of I've kind of taken it to the extreme and said, just run them. Just work on running. Like, yes, you can do Romanian deadlifts and all these other, Nordics and all these hamstring things. Do you absolutely need to? No, you don't have to. When in reality, like with my own son, we're doing all of those posterior chain exercises too. But I'm trying to take people and say, like, let's solve this running piece right now, and just lay off that other stuff, and then you can always go back to it. And that's, I think, a big hallmark of the progression is I will not allow people to do lower body resistance training during my return to play
Hmm.
process,
Interesting. Okay.
because it creates problems. It's like it runs interference to what I'm trying to
Yeah.
do, which is less tension, more skill in terms of that intramuscular coordination. I don't want people feeling stiff or feeling like any sort of DOMs or anything like that. So once they reach, the volume and the velocity that I want them to reach, say it's like, again, that 2 to 3 week progression, okay, return back to lifting, right? We've got everything in place. We've got everything hardwired in place where we need it. Now go back to lifting. There's never a problem. But there's always been the case where I've said, this is what I need to do. And then somebody, a third party comes in, whether it's their personal trainer, an athletic trainer who isn't part of our process, or a medical person, and they take them into the gym and they do Nordics or whatever. And then, of course, the athlete shows up and what's wrong? I'm just really sore in the hamstring right now. And I'm like, well, yesterday everything was fine. Oh, well, I did this extra stuff. So, I just keep them away from that stuff. We'll do some upper body work. But whenever I've had anybody interfere with doing some lower body work as part of what I'm doing, it's only created problems. So I'm very careful with that.
Yeah, it speaks to the fact that there's just so much discretion and judgment involved based on timelines and different circumstances. Um, One thing I was curious about is, we've kind of focused more on like the rehab piece, and it is a spectrum between the rehab and the training. And you also mentioned that, sometimes you wish you had more continuity or follow up with some of these athletes. You know, when athletes are healthy in your experience, like what do you wish that the athletes themselves, their teams were doing more of to kind of make them, to kind of mitigate the potential for some of these hamstring injuries? Like what are you seeing as the low hanging fruit and sort of hamstring injury risk mitigation that a lot of teams aren't really addressing?
Yeah, I really think it comes back to some sort of gap analysis where you're looking at, um, what isn't being covered. And I think, like if we use the soccer example, I think Dave Tenney was really good about bringing that to my attention about, okay, um, we have to have a mix of qualities happening in practice to make sure that, one, they do the short sighted stuff, the direction change and all that. And then they do a bigger field, and scenario where they do longer runs at higher speed. And I think that's something that I'm always looking at. And even with the European team I was working with, um, when the players were missing practice, and just doing linear sprints, the trainer said, I'm getting them to do more multi-directional stuff because they're missing practice, and that's where all the multi-directional stuff happens. But when they return to practice, I do more linear stuff
Hmm.
because that's what they're missing, the longer linear runs at upright position, right? So, understanding that interplay of what's being taken care of and what might be missing, I think is
Yeah.
really important as part of this whole process. And it's so easy to go like, let's be specific, like let's be sports specific. But if they're practicing and playing, that's pretty sports specific. It's just those areas around the edges that I'm concerned about, the longer runs and, how that may be missing as part of their training, right?
Yeah, and
So
that's funny, the specificity argument, because a lot of times specificity is used to justify not doing maximal velocity sprinting, because the idea is that, athletes don't reach max velocity a lot in field sports, therefore it's not necessary. But if all they're doing is accelerating and changing direction in, on the field or in practice or in the game, you can make a case that what you should be doing off the field is exactly what they don't get in the game, which is max velocity sprinting because of the buffer that it provides, the speed reserve. And you're seeing more people that I think are taking that approach and being outspoken about it. But sometimes it's almost counterintuitive. Like what you need is exactly not the most specific thing.
yeah, and I think there's some cases, and you watch like there's certain players like this whole load management thing in the NBA has been interesting. But if you go back and talk to Al Vermeil, like they didn't really load manage. Like the players who played a lot tended to be more durable because they played a lot, right? And then as soon as you start pulling pieces out of that puzzle and you start saying, well, we're going to skip this game and we're going to skip this, or they're going to limit their minutes, maybe that does make them a little more fragile, right? So taking that anti-fragile approach is interesting as well. So it's complicated. Like I'm not smart enough to figure all of this out, but I do know that um, resting isn't always good. And
Yeah.
like we talked about in rehab, like, oh, you need to rest. Like I've had even scenarios like because I'm 51 now, I think, oh, I need rest, right? And I was doing some longer runs and my knee started bothering me, like the inside of my knee, and I thought, well, I just need to do less, right? And of course it got worse, right? So then got back into squatting more and doing all these things and doing all my drills. Like that's the thing, like I don't even practice my what I preach sometimes. So I'm like, okay, I got to do what I would tell somebody to do, and I did it. And of course, it was better, right? So it's very interesting.
Yeah, speaking of load management, I mean, I think a lot of people have seen the Last Dance. I love the part where Rodman went on the bender in Vegas, missed a couple of days in practice, and then his first day back at practice, he was like winning the sprints. So
Yeah,
uh, different time, but who knows what the right answer is? But I don't think it's yeah. There's there's something to be said for being a cockroach too, and just being able to take that beating and keep coming back. Um,
yeah. I saw somebody else post about that. I think it was Josh Funk, and he was talking about like people aren't exercising as much, but guess what? Arthritis is going up, right? So, and I'm like, yeah, that makes sense, man. You got to do a certain amount of activity, and that sweet spot is critical. Like in finding that, knowing where that sweet spot is probably like the gold mine. If you know how much volume to give somebody to keep them healthy, you're always going to be in a pretty good place.
yeah, and then where can people learn more about some of the work that you're doing, your courses, and just your overall approach?
Um, I'll try to put stuff on my websites. Websites seem less relevant these days because of social media, but I have like two websites, the sprintcoach.com and then the course is runningmechanics.com. That runningmechanics.com site was basically for the in-person courses, and now I have to change that over so it's all virtual for at least I guess the next year. But those are the two websites, and then on like Instagram and Twitter, I'm at Derek M Hansen, Derek Matthew Hansen. So I'm trying to put information on there and trying to get on as many podcasts and do as many things as possible just to get the word out. But yeah, it's always good to talk to people in their individual professions and find out, okay, well, what's a better way for me to get my information out to reach that audience, because I think it's so easy to say like this is how I do it and just expect everybody to follow you, but at the same time there has to be some sort of kind of meet in the middle, I think, too.
Yeah, and so are those the running mechanics courses? Are they available online or virtually now, or is that in the works?
I have the base foundation course. So that's if you take the level one course and you can find it, the best way to find it is just through my Instagram, and I have a list of links there.
Okay.
And I have an Instagram site dedicated to it, Running Mechanics, at
Okay.
Running Mechanics. But the level one foundation course is important because it's about all these things we're talking about good mechanics, having some basic volume around those mechanics. And then the course that I'm working on now is the actual rehab course.
Cool.
And that will have, okay, this is what and I use the hamstring rehab protocol as the model for everything, because it ended up being, that's what I started with. The influence was, a lot of track coaches that I had as mentors. And so okay, this is, 10 yards, 10-meter approach to acceleration. This is why it works. These are the studies that show why it works. And then I also do it for lower body injury, like lower leg injury, calf, plantar fascia, Achilles, ACL, everything, quad strain. I just have some variations on it, but it's the same approach. It's the running based approach.
Okay. Now, what's the ETA on that medical course coming online?
Well, if you put the screws to me, Doug, I'll get it done hopefully by the end of February. So
That's all
maybe
right.
sooner.
That's not that far. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That'll be
Everything.
probably like, pretty close to when this airs in a couple of weeks. So that's great. So hopefully we'll get the word out because I know that, I've taken them in person, but I would like to have that as a reference to continually refer back to. And we've got a bunch of students coming in, so it's going to be on their list of things to watch before they come. So
Well, that's a great thing about the virtual is that if I do it in a weekend, I mean, you can take notes and you'll get handouts and all that, but you may forget some of it. Whereas if I
sure.
do it in this course format, you have it forever. You can refer back to it. And I've actually put in more time. So if it's like an 8 hour course regularly in person, now it's 12 to 15 hours because I know you can do it at your own pace.
Yeah, I definitely miss the in-person interaction, but it is also really hard to just, especially now having a kid, give up an entire weekend to go to a course and just to, even to be anywhere for 8 hours, no matter how engaging it is, it's just hard to absorb all that at once. I've been loving all these online courses that have been coming out. It just allows you to go at a much, more reasonable pace. So, hopefully there's some kind of, when this is over with COVID, there's a mix of everything's available online, but you could still kind of do certain things in person and get the best of both worlds.
Yeah, I think what I want to do is basically kind of have a hybrid. Like, okay, you pay for the course, you this is the online, and then when I come to your city, we'll do a full practical, so we don't have to pull out the slides like you've already seen that.
Yeah, no,
So
no more PowerPoint in person.
no,
Yeah.
no, that's a taboo.
All right. Well, I appreciate your time. This is really cool stuff, and a lot of practical application here. So, thanks again, and look forward to talking again soon.
Yes, thanks for having me on again as usual, and I hope to see you in person soon.
Hopefully. All right. Bye. Thank you for listening to the Resilient Performance Podcast. As a thank you for listening, we'd like to offer a 10% discount on our online products, which you can find at resilientperformance.com. We'd like you to use the promo code PODCAST, PODCAST, to get the 10% off. Right now we have the Resilient Movement Foundations course online format for you to purchase there. And we hope to grow that soon before the end of the year and have some other offerings. We hope you enjoy. Again, that's promo code PODCAST, PODCAST, for 10% off. Thanks.